being recorded.
Okay, you can mute yourself now. Well, I think that's a 7:03, so I think it's about time to start our March 2022 monthly meeting. And got a couple of announcements before I turn it over to Peter. First off, we're going to do our first annual bird festival at Flaming Geyser this June on the 25th, Saturday the 25th, so mark your calendars. And I'm going to be scheduling a Zoom meeting to get started on it and to see who's out there that's willing to help out with this and assign different activities for it. So I'm pretty excited. The state of Washington Parks Department's pretty exciting because it kind of sounds like this is the first time this has been tried, or it's been a long time since it's been tried where an Audubon group has co-hosted it. So, and Flaming Geyser, the perfect place in June, lots of birds. Okay, and enough said for that. So we'll be posting that on our website and on our monthly newsletter, more information on that. And I hope to see some people willing to help out with that. We've got a lot of neat events planned. One of them being something that Cindy Flanagan is going to be doing. And Cindy wants the stage here for a couple minutes to talk about something she has quite a passion for. So Cindy. Got yourself unmuted?
Everybody's muted, can't hear anything.
Can you hear me now? Excellent. Okay, sorry about that little techie issue. Always good to start with and get the bugs worked out, but just really excited about our opportunity that Jay's talking about with our bird festival, and hope that we get some volunteers coming out, and it should be a great day. And one of the things that I'm just going to talk about right now is about our Rainier Audubon nature journaling sessions that we have every month. And this month it's on March 27th, this Sunday, and it's from 3 to 4:30 on Zoom. And really excited because it's kind of an extension of Peter's work on Alcids, and we're going to explore Protection Island seabirds. And you know, it's really a laid back session. All you need is a pencil and a paper. It's not about making pretty pictures. It's about exploring in your observations and really delving in. And so, like I say, we're going to springboard off Peter's presentation, and you know, we're really lucky because we have some really great photos and stuff from Peter Lum, and also from Carly Randall, and some really cool videos that we're going to use to explore Protection Island and all these different seabirds and why that island is so important. And last year, there was a fire on that island, and, you know, just really raises that issue of conservation and awareness, and what we need to do to increase awareness about this important place and these seabirds. So would love to have you come and join us, and I'll put in the chat, I'll put the Zoom link for anybody who's interested in my email if you would like to know more information. So hope to see you out there. Okay, thanks, Jay.
Thank you, Cindy. tell Carly that her photos are getting too good. She's gonna get me jealous here pretty quick. Okay, tonight, as Cindy touched on, we've got Peter Hodum, who is a professor at UPS, isn't it? And in biology, and he has the fortune of every once in a while getting to go to Chile and see what their Alcid population is doing, as well as here in the Pacific Northwest. So without further ado, I'll hand this over to Peter, and they'll get us updated on what's happening to the Alcids in our area at least, and probably Chile too. So,
well, thanks very much. I'm going to, let's see if I can share screen. So I'll do that. Can everybody see my screen now? And Cindy, I love that activity. That's just so cool to hear about. And I loved your little essay there. I was skimming it, I must confess, as you were talking, and the illustration of the pigeon guillemots. So I think that's wonderful. And I am going to talk a little bit more about Protection Islands tonight and speak to the fire as well, because I think you raised really important points about that island being an underappreciated gem of our region. It's remarkable what it possesses, and yet so many of us aren't really aware of, just how important an island it is for our region. So tonight I'm going to, in the past, when I've had the opportunity to speak with you, I've spoken primarily about work in Chile and a few other places, but mainly on tube-nosed seabirds. And for those of you that know me and have attended previous talks, you'll recognize that I have a particular weakness. My wife calls it an obsession with tube-nosed seabirds, so petrels, albatrosses, and shearwaters, and that continues unabated. But I'm not. They're going to feature in here very, very peripherally. But the focus tonight is to talk about Alcids in our waters and what we know about their ecology and aspects of their conservation. So as always, I prefer this to be really informal. I know it's harder to be informal virtually, but please do feel free to unmute if you've got a question as I'm presenting. It's a little bit, those of you that wrestle with Zoom, you know that it can be a little bit harder to track the chat while I'm screen sharing, but I can also answer questions at the end. So when I moved up to Washington nearly 20 years ago now, I had started working down in Chile. Most of my seabird work had been on petrels and shearwaters and storm petrels, and I wasn't necessarily looking to work on Alcids. I was kind of focused on Southern Hemisphere primarily. But then I had the opportunity to do some work out on Tatoosh Island, shown here in this photo. And so that's Cape Flattery on the left, Tatoosh just offshore to the right. Remarkable island, so that we were able to work out there with permission from the Macaw Nation. And I did spend several summers, actually 5 or 6 summers working out there. And I wound up really becoming fascinated by Alcids. So here are a couple of images from the island. This is in the upper left here is the seaward side of Tatoosh with these steep cliffs. Here on the lower right is a meadow on the south facing side of the island, just above a low bluff. And this is prime Rhinoceros Auklet breeding habitat. In fact, you can see a little burrow entrance just there where my cursor is. In fact, I'm gonna move in and use my laser pointer. So right there, I think is a little bit more visible. So I started working out there initially because of Tufted Puffins, but the work I really became fascinated by the Rhinoceros Auklets, and they're on the island as well. And I thought, well, a comparative study would be interesting. And 16 years later, or whenever it is, I'm still working on Alcids here in Washington, in collaboration with several close colleagues and friends who I'll show later. So everything I'm presenting here tonight, I want to emphasize is collaborative work. This is not possible by a single person. What I'm going to do is just kind of work through our Alcids of our waters, of Washington waters, including these 3 species. I'm going to focus more on a few species. I don't have time to go into depth on all of them, but I want to give you at least a quick overview of what we know about them. And then if there are particular questions that emerge on species that I didn't talk about in as great a detail, again, please feel free to ask. So I thought it might be helpful to, what I've learned over the years is that not everybody is as obsessed with seabirds as I am. And so, giving a quick overview of some of the natural history of seabirds, I think can help people think about some of the conservation challenges that they confront in a more holistic way. And then transition into an overview of what we know about the status of Alcids in Washington waters, so both on the outer coast and within the Salish Sea. And then that will kind of funnel us into research on a few focal species that we've been devoting more of our energy to. And that kind of then stepping out a little bit more broadly to look at threats to seabirds in Washington and steps forward. Where can we go from here? So natural history of seabirds. This is also a photo from Tatoosh Island, some of the west-facing cliffs where common murres nest in great numbers, as you can see along this ledge. Just stunning to see them nesting there. So Alcids one way to think about them is they're the northern hemisphere equivalent of penguins. Ecologically, they are indistinguishable. But Alcids are restricted to the northern hemisphere, just like penguins, with maybe the odd Galapagos penguin that just crosses the equator in the Galapagos Islands. Penguins are restricted to the southern hemisphere, and what seems to have kept them separate is those subtropical and tropical waters that tend to be fairly nutrient deficient, and they certainly are productive in some respects, but for a fish-feeding bird or a piscivorous bird like an alcid or a penguin, they're not particularly productive waters. And so you can think about that band of warm tropical waters as being a separator between the northern and southern hemispheres, oceanographically. Some species move freely across that area, like a lot of albatross and petrel species, shearwaters. Other species are really blocked by that change, really significant change in the oceanography. So northern hemisphere, but within the family of Alcids, they actually have a fairly wide range of life histories. So some of them are and we have both extremes here in Washington. So if you think about inshore species, a classic species is the pigeon guillemot or the black guillemot, in the Atlantic. They forage inshore. You don't tend to see them out over deeper water. They stay inshore pretty much year round. In contrast, things like tufted puffins, most of the population of Rhinoceros Auklets, although they're kind of inshore breeders, they tend to feed over deeper water. And when they migrate out of their breeding areas, they go out offshore. In fact, even today, we don't really have a good sense of where tufted puffins winter specifically, because they're hundreds of miles out at sea, somewhere in the North Pacific. And it's really hard during the winter months, which are not usually the most conducive months of the year to doing surveys and seeing birds on the water. So they use the ocean differently, and they basically segregate and use different parts of the water column and our waters based on their diving capacity, how many chicks they're raising, and other aspects of their natural history. They are wing-propelled pursuit divers. And if you haven't seen them, there's some really nice videos out there, and most of you have probably seen video footage of Alcids diving, whether it's murres or puffins. You want to see it live, you can see it up at the Seattle Aquarium, but also right here in Tacoma. The Point Defiant Zoo has a wonderful exhibit with tufted puffins, horned puffins, and common murres, with a pool and a glass viewing area, and you can actually watch them diving and really appreciate how efficient and how graceful they are underwater, which is something I think that's underappreciated, because we typically see them on colonies. We see them desperately trying to not fall out of the sky as they're flying, which isn't an alcid at its most graceful. They really are marine animals. They have adapted highly to an aquatic lifestyle, and that includes diving. Watching them dive, you see the beauty and the real grace in them. They do have what's called high wing loading. So if you've watched any of these alcids fly, whether it's a pigeon guillemot or a murre or a puffin, they are always beating their wings frantically. And so a high wing loading means that they have a small wing area relative to the weight of the bird. And you might think, well, why? Why might that be advantageous? And if you think about the trade-offs that all of these alcids have to make, they're trading off two things which are almost mutually exclusive: efficient diving with efficient flight. Very few birds can pull that off. And so one way to do that is to go to one extreme, which is the penguin extreme, where they basically said, forget flying, we're just going to dive. And we are going to dive really, really well. And they are the most accomplished diving birds in the world. Interestingly, though, alcids are not that far behind them. And some alcid species can get down to depths of 70 meters, like over 200 feet on a single dive. So they're very accomplished divers. And what they have basically come to is an evolutionary trade-off where they can still fly, but the wing shape and the size has been shaped by efficient diving. So they're still capable of flight, but they're kind of on the edge of the continuum towards not particularly efficient flight. They can fly fast. They can actually cover pretty good distances, but it costs them a lot of energy. So that's an important part of their life history, is that trade-off, diving and flying. How do you do both? Most of the species, including the common murres you can see here, are colonial or at least semi-colonial. There are some exceptions. So the Brachioramphus murrelets, like the marbled murrelet, is an exception to this general rule, but most of them are in medium to large colonies, or at least semi-colonial, like pigeon guillemots, where occasionally you'll find an isolated burrow or nest, but generally they're in at least loose association with other pigeon guillemots that are breeding. And they're primarily migratory. That migration might be local. It might be within, for example, in our area, within the Salish Sea. It might actually be hundreds to 1,000+ miles. So some of the Rhinoceros Auklets that breed on Protection Island migrate all the way down to California. Tufted Puffins from the Salish Sea are somewhere out in the North Pacific right now, hundreds of miles from shore. So again, there's a range of strategies. So I'm just going to take a step back to broaden our conversation briefly, and then zero back in on alcids. But we look at what we have here in Washington with respect to seabirds. Within the Salish Sea, there are 73 species that are highly dependent seasonally or year-round So that includes things like some of the sea ducks, that come down that we get to see during the winter months, but then migrate out of the system to breed, up in the Arctic and subarctic. On the outer coast, we have 50 plus species seasonally. Those numbers tend to peak in the summer months because we get a lot of species that migrate up from the southern hemisphere and take advantage of our productive upwelling waters on the outer coast of Washington, and then disappear to move back down into southern hemisphere waters to breed and avoid the low productivity and really stormy conditions that we typically have during our winter months. If we look kind of across those species, and especially those in the Salish Sea, we have two species that are state and or federally listed. Both of them are Alcids, the Marbled Murrelet and the Tufted Puffin. If we include the outer coast, it includes some additional species like pink-footed shearwaters, which are not listed within the US, but are globally listed. But it is interesting that of the 7 species of Alcids 6 to 7 that we have in our area, 2 of them are the 2 that are listed at state and federal levels. So then if we look at the breeding bird community, so this is where I get to talk a little bit about storm petrels and petrels and shearwaters. So what I've done here in this figure is just put the families of seabirds that we have breeding here in Washington. So this includes both the Salish Sea and the outer coast. So storm petrels, we have 2 species that breed in Washington, both on the outer coast. They get blown into the Salish Sea on occasion, but they never have bred, as far as we know, in the Salish Sea. One of them is a species of conservation concern. It's not state listed or federally listed yet, but the Leach's storm petrel. So over here on this column, these are the 4-letter acronyms for this relevant species. And I should mention this column, this third column, is how many of the species are vulnerable or endangered. So in orange are species of conservation concern. Petrels and shearwaters, possibly there's one. There's indirect suggestions that Manx shearwaters, which are only known to breed in the Atlantic, may be breeding in small numbers on islands here in Washington. We don't have any direct evidence of it, but every year we see Manx shearwaters on the outer coast of Washington. It could just be a few geographically embarrassed individuals that went up the wrong side of the Americas and they're in the wrong ocean basin. But there may be enough there that there are breeding, at least a small breeding population. That uncertainty, I think, points to some of the excitement of the work that we get to do, that there's still a lot of stuff to discover, that we don't know, even about islands just offshore on the outer coast of Washington. So cormorants, we have 3 species. None of them are of conservation concern: pelagic cormorants, grants, cormorants, and double-cresteds. Gulls and terns, especially with gulls, most of you that are out birding and do any seabird birding, that gull taxonomy, it's a mess. They hybridize, they back cross. There's all sorts of messiness with gulls. None of them are of conservation concern, but we also have pasky and terns. But where I really wanted to focus was that last row, the Alcids. So we have 6 confirmed breeding species. And again, 2 of those, as I just mentioned, Tufted Puffins and Marbled Murrelets, are state and or federally listed. 4 that we know breed and breed pretty widely that are not of listed conservation concern at present: Rhinoceros Auklets, pigeon guillemots, Cassin's auklets, and common murres. And then we have a 7th potential breeding species, ancient murrelets. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But again, this is another example, these question marks, and the fact that even on pretty well-known islands on the outer coast of Washington, we don't necessarily know what breeding seabirds occur out on all of these islands. It's both a challenge from a conservation perspective, because how do we know what issues may attend species if we don't even know what's breeding on islands? And then there's the issue of, if we don't even know what's breeding on an island, how do we know how they're doing? So that means there's some neat opportunities, but it does make conservation planning for some of these islands and kind of trying to think systematically about conservation strategies difficult. So just to give some faces to some of these species, again, so Tufted Puffin in Washington State, it was listed in 2015. So I was involved with this. This is the status report for the Tufted Puffin, published by the state of Washington. That was the basis for the recommendation for listing. It was subsequently listed, so it's now state listed, and we now have a Tufted Puffin recovery plan that I was involved with as well, that helps lay out some of the priority conservation actions. It's also, although recently a petition that a bunch of us were involved with to have it listed within the lower 48, within what we call the California current system, which includes Washington, Oregon, and California, because of a decision by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do a range-wide review. That petition was declined. We're in the process now of trying to show that the population of interest for us within the California current is a distinct population from that in Alaska. If we can actually show that, we will go back to Fish and Wildlife and say, now we think there's stronger evidence because of what's happening to the populations in the lower 48. And I'll come back and provide a bit more detail about that a little bit later, because Tufted Puffin is one of the focal species I'll be talking with you about. We've got Marbled Murrelets. Washington, they're listed as endangered. They're federally listed as threatened. I wish I could claim credit for this photo. It's a stunning photo, but I want to make sure that you see that it's courtesy of Tim Zarowski. I am envious of this photo. Rhinoceros Auklet is another species that we work on. They're a species of least concern. They're actually doing really well throughout Washington, including in the Salish Sea. So their populations on their two main breeding islands in the Salish Sea, Protection Island and Smith Island, have both increased since the 70s, which is pretty impressive given, if you think about the disturbance to the marine systems that increasing human population in our region have caused. So they're basically thriving in our waters. Cassin's auklet, just on the outer coast of Washington. You don't get them breeding in the Salish Sea. They're near threatened, so we have virtually no data on them in Washington. The little data that exists are from at-sea surveys, and those data suggest that they are declining, but there have been no colony-based research on this species in Washington State yet. We're trying to get a little bit started because we're concerned that they could be a species that is flying below the radar, metaphorically speaking, and could be declining without people really picking it up. Pigeon guillemot, thankfully, one of the iconic species of our region. They're of least concern. They seem to be doing quite well throughout most of their range in Washington. And then common murres are also a species of least concern from a conservation perspective. So ancient murrelets, this is a species that they are a species of least concern. They're that mysterious species that there's some suggestions that they might be breeding in Washington. So about 100 years ago, there was a single record from Carroll Island of an egg that was described as an ancient murrelet egg. Since that time, there have been, and I don't think that egg exists. I think it was described, and I don't think it's in a collection anywhere. No reason to think that it was incorrectly identified. But since then, there's been absolutely no confirmation that this species breeds in Washington waters. And so we've been working with the Fish and Wildlife Service because almost all of the islands on the outer coast of Washington are part of a National Wildlife Refuge complex, which is wonderful because it means they are under arguably the most rigorous form of protection that we can afford land in our country. But these birds are nocturnal. They are burrow or crevice nesters, and they breed on small islands. And so they're pretty cryptic and they can be difficult to pick up. They also breed really early in the season, at times when it's actually even more difficult to be able to land on a lot of these islands. So what we've been doing in collaboration with the Fish and Wildlife Service is going out to islands that we think have good potential. And I should say that what we have seen in Washington, and this is where we're really confident that they're breeding here, is these birds, I'll go back, this is a more interesting picture. So this is a single adult in breeding plumage. But ancient murrelets have a pretty remarkable and extreme life history in that once the chick hatches, within a day or so of hatching, these downy little fluff balls follow the parents out to sea. So there's basically no parental care on the island. So think about a downy little chick, maybe this big, jumping out into the Pacific Ocean, following mom and dad out into, the storms of the Pacific. This is happening in April, May, maybe early June. And they do it very successfully. But what we have seen on the outer coast of Washington, and in fact, a couple of times, even around Protection Island, we've seen adults with chicks. And some of those chicks are small enough that they could not have covered the distance from the nearest described colonies, which are at the north end of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. So they have to have been produced more locally, just because there's no way they could have, in the few weeks that they have been at sea, covered the hundreds of miles of open ocean between the Scott Islands or farther north and our waters here in Washington. So these islands are difficult to access. A lot of them are fragile. And so what we've tried to do is use technology that gives us insights while retaining a very light footprint on the islands. And we've been using what are called acoustic recording units, which are these remarkable pieces of technology. They're essentially a glorified recorder. So they're recording ambient environmental sounds. They're quite sensitive, so they can record out to 50 meters or so. And you can program them. So you can tell them what sampling frequency you want them to record. You can go onto an island, deploy them, leave them all season, come back at the end of the season, retrieve them, download the files, and then analyze those audio files. So you're getting acoustic, and you're looking for acoustic signatures. Now, some of this is done by folks who are far more tech savvy than we are. So we collaborate with acoustics experts, and with artificial intelligence and machine learning, they can actually they can develop algorithms that identify the vocal signatures of species of interest. So in the past, what you would have done was put one of these out on an island, and then you would have had to manually listen to hundreds and hundreds of hours of audio recordings. Machines can do that for us now. And so what we get is information like this. So this is for storm petrels, and this is from mainly Destruction Island. So I'll walk you through this figure. Here's the date. These are some data from 2017, so May, June, July, date across from May to October on the x-axis. And then we have a series of panels. Each of these panels corresponds to a location where one of these recording units was deployed. So you can see there's one of these top 5 on Destruction Island. This one was on East Bedelta Island, which is north of Destruction Island. It's between La Push and Cape Flattery, and then Middle Bedelta. And then what you see in each of the panels is the number of storm petrel calls picked up per minute. So for this, just this panel up top, basically nothing. So, you know, there was one little blip in August. It was probably a single bird just flying over and it happened to vocalize and get recorded. But it suggests that in the area surrounding the placement of this device, they're not breeding. This island, this location, also on Destruction, some birds flying overhead vocalizing, but very low, and lots of zeros. So again, no real evidence that they're breeding anywhere within the radius of the detection radius of this device, and so on. So we get down to this. So the evidence for Destruction Island, at least where we put these devices, is that they're probably not breeding in those areas. They might be somewhere else on Destruction Island, and we just haven't found that yet. East Bedelta, lots of zeros. There were a few nights in July, August, and then it goes basically back to zero. In contrast, we look at Middle Bedelta, and you get vocalizations regularly recorded throughout the season. Small numbers, but that's the sort of pattern that suggests that storm petrels are breeding on Middle Bedelta, at least in small numbers. So we can also use that same approach to ask, what about ancient murrelets? So here's a map of, in the inset here is the outer coast of Washington, Strait of Juan de Fuca, here's Cape Flattery. This red area is the enlarged map here. So this is where it's kind of mid-northern coast. The Bedeltas are just offshore. This is Olympic National Park. And again, looking for evidence of ancient murrelets. And when we saw this, we got very excited. So this isn't necessarily going to mean anything to you, but this is what the data look like when you graphically portray. This is called an, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on what it's called. It's an acoustic. It's representing the acoustic signature of the call. So the frequency here, and that this is time. So here's a call, here are calls. This is a diagnostic call of an ancient murrelet. So the machine, you know, as the computer's going through it, it picks it up and it identifies it and flags it. And we were getting multiple calls from Middle Bedelta. So it suggests, and these are based on the island. So it means these birds are on the island and they're vocalizing. And it was at the time of the year when you think, yep, it coincides with the breeding season. So the next step is to try to go and probe a bunch of burrows and maybe put some trail cameras out there to see if we can actually confirm that they're breeding there. But that's the sort of approach that we can use. We're also using a similar sort of approach on Alexander Island, which is between La Push, so north of Ruby Beach, between Ruby Beach and La Push, so outer coast. Another island that's part of the National Wildlife Refuge Complex. Really cool island, very poorly described in terms of a lot of the seabirds on it. I wanted to include this photo just because it's a nice photo of some of my colleagues. So this is Scott Pearson, who is a senior research scientist with the state, with Department of Fish and Wildlife. Sue Thomas here is the refuge biologist for with Fish and Wildlife Service, and a wonderful colleague. Chad Norris in the back works for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife under Scott, a boat captain extraordinaire. Tom Good is with NOAA Northwest Fisheries Science Center. And Tom and Scott and I have been doing seabird work now together for 17 years. And I just really thankful for the opportunity to work with them here in Washington. They're wonderful people. They do great work. And I'm really fortunate. And then I wanted to show, this is also a student who graduated 2 years ago now, Lily, who did some great work looking at Tufted Puffin diets. So there's heavy student involvement in these projects as well, through University of Puget Sound. The island is, thankfully, it's never, as far as anybody knows, it's never had introduced mammals on it. So it's in great condition. And you see these wonderful perennial grasses, these bunch grasses that stabilize the soil and form this really stable substrate, kind of a complex habitat. And burrowing seabirds love this. So you can, I'll just circle a few here. So here's a burrow entrance just in the foreground here. Burrow entrance here, a burrow entrance here, a burrow entrance here, another one here. There's another one tucked around the corner and one over here. Really high densities of burrows, great quality habitat. But because there are multiple, these could be Cassin's auklets, they could be storm petrels, they could be Rhinoceros auklets. And so what are they? So that's part of the challenge. This is an island that can be difficult to access. Again, we try to minimize our footprint, our presence on it. So we use trail cameras, which will record motion. So record birds coming and going. We'll also use the acoustic recording units, and we will use cameras, infrared cameras, to probe some burrows to confirm that what's in certain proportion of burrows. So this is the slope, one of the slopes that we work on to give you a sense of scale. Here's one of my colleagues just on the slope. And then just as a frame of reference, right on the horizon back there, that's Destruction Island. It's another about 7 or 8 miles to the south down the coast from Alexander Island. But you can see here's the mainland. We're just offshore if you look at a map. So Destruction Island is another island that we've been working on. Destruction since 2008. Alexander's more recent. We've only been working there a couple of years, and some of that work was interrupted by the pandemic and really restrictions to what we could do. Remarkable island, Destruction Island. We work on Destruction. We've been working on Rhinoceros auklets, like this one, bringing back herring. And then Tufted Puffins. And then within the Salish Sea, we've been working on Protection Island since 2006. And I did want to come back to, and Cindy, and again, you provided such a wonderful introduction. Wanted to talk a little bit about the fire. And because some of you will have heard of it, and you might be curious about what the consequences were, what the impacts. And it's kind of it's a story that is both hopeful and I think also cautionary. So the fire, this happened at the beginning of August. The timing was actually better than it could have been, because in the area that burned, most of the vegetation was already dead and dry. So it burned very quickly. There wasn't a lot of fuel, and at least half of the Rhinoceros auklets, which are a burrow nesting seabird, had already fledged. So the fire burned, it burned remarkably, it burned right up to so the island is actually split in management. About 3/4 of the island is part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. The southern part of the island, including Keenan Spit, is state-owned. It's a state wildlife refuge. So it's administered by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. The fire started on Keenan Spit, burned upslope, and burned almost right up to the line that demarcates state and federal land. We did lose individuals. So this is a dead Rhinoceros auklet chick that we found on the surface. I was able to get out to the island 2 days after the fire to do a quick survey. But it did burn quickly. It burned through the areas fast and pretty light. And you can see even here, not even all of that dry vegetation burned up. So we're thankful that it was not more severe. There was mortality of gulls. There was mortality of Rhinoceros auklets. Probably not terribly severe. But again, as Cindy mentioned, I think it's a cautionary tale. if the wind had been less favorable, part of the reason that it didn't burn right across the island was we had a pretty favorable wind. It restricted its progress across the island. If that wind had been a southerly, that whole island would have burned, and we would have lost a lot of habitat. So it's a vulnerable island. It's one of the 2 remaining islands that has tufted puffins still breeding on it in the Salish Sea. It's the 8th largest Rhinoceros Auklet breeding colony in the world. There's over 50,000 pairs breeding on the island. We have hundreds of, well, probably a few thousand pair of pigeon guillemots scattered around the island in various places. There's an important glaucous winged gull breeding colony there, and it really is a gem. So making sure that we're aware of that, and that we demand that it continues to receive the attention and the resources and the support for its protection. Thankfully, again, it is fully protected. Sometimes that's not quite enough, though, and so we need people to advocate for it. We also work on Smith Island. Most of this work, so this is off the north end of Whidbey, almost due west of the Naval Air Station, if you need a frame of reference, maybe a little bit south of west. This is also National Wildlife Refuge Complex. We haven't worked on island for a few years, but we do work on boat-based surveys. This is really, and sadly, the last stronghold of tufted puffins in the Salish Sea. And I'll come back to numbers in just a little bit, in just a moment, because I'm going to transition to talking about tufted puffins. So what do we know about tufted puffins, and why are we so concerned about them? Well, if we look at what we know, and what I want to emphasize is that a lot of this information is incomplete. And when I do give you numbers, I want you to take them, aside from the number of colonies, when we get to things like numbers of individuals, they're very crude estimates because we just don't have good data historically. So if we look at this figure on the right, I know it's a little bit busy, but I think it's really helpful to visualize the big picture for what's going on with tufted puffins in our state. So if you look at these upper 3 panels, this is the outer coast of Washington, the same 3 panels over 3 different time periods. The leftmost panel is 1888 to 1977. The middle panel is 1978 to 1984. And then the rightmost panel is 2007 to 2010. And the information that we have communicates 2 things. Each dot represents a breeding colony, an island, where tufted puffins nested historically. And then the color and size of the dot corresponds to the size of the colony. So was it a small colony, 1 to 99 individuals, the little red dot? Green was 100 to 1,000 individuals. Between 1,000 and 10,000 is orange. Purple, greater than 10,000. In this nearly 100-year period, and we don't know when some of these colonies blinked out or when they dropped in size, but we actually had a couple of colonies that were at least 10,000 birds on the outer coast of Washington. But if you look at what's happened, especially in this most recent period, just in the last few decades, we've lost colonies. So entire colonies have disappeared. There's fewer dots, and the size of the dots has gotten smaller, which means that we have fewer colonies, and the colonies that we have are smaller in size. The same story here for down here in the lower right. This is for our Salish Sea colonies. Historically, and you'll see that none of them were huge. The largest colonies were Smith and Protection Island. But over time, we've lost the colonies. So current day, and those of you that spend time in the waters of the San Juans, you just don't see. You can go, we've done surveys throughout the San Juans. You just don't see tufted puffins up there anymore. It's just we've lost all the colonies except for Smith and protection. So what does that mean numerically? Well, it means that in the early 1900s, we had 43 known active breeding colonies for tufted puffins. We still had 35 of them, as recently as the early 80s. But since that time, so really just in the last 35 to 40 years, the number of colonies has plummeted. So we have less than half of the historically active colonies still active today, about 40%. And then if we look at the colony sizes, prior to 1978, we had 9 colonies that were at least 1,000 birds, and 2 of those were over 10,000 birds. Most recently, we don't have a single colony that's even 1,000 birds. We only have 3 that are actually greater than 100 birds. So really significant declines, using multiple metrics. So the annual estimated rate of decline, and these again, this is very crude, but even if we're off by a few percentage points, that sort of rate of decline for a seabird means it will disappear from our waters within decades unless this trend is reversed. So again, to give you, what does that mean? Well, early 1900s, very crude estimate, maybe about 25,000 birds. As late as the early 1980s, we'd lost maybe 10% of them, but still pretty good numbers. And then in the last few decades, we've dropped nearly an order of magnitude. We're down to 10 to 12% of what we think was there a century ago. Very worrying. What we're seeing in Washington is mirrored by what's been documented in Oregon. So 90+% decline also since the 1980s. And then California, 90+% decline since the early 1900s. So it's throughout the California current system, there are stressors that are occurring at the scale of the system that are really impacting tufted puffins.
Hey, Peter?
Yes.
Is this a forage fish issue?
Yes, so that is a good question. So, it's one of the challenges of working with this species. Well, there's a couple. One is that despite it being, such an iconic species, who doesn't love puffins, right? Everybody loves puffins. And you might think that they'd be really well studied. They're well studied up in Alaska, but down here in Oregon, Washington, California, they're not particularly well known. So things as basic as what's their diet? Has their diet changed? We don't have good data to compare what their diet is today with what it was 30 or 40 years ago. We're having to use some indirect techniques. What these techniques are suggesting, and one of them is called stable isotope analysis, that a student of mine did a wonderful project on that we're working on getting published. But what that technique allows you to do is use museum specimens and ask questions about where they're feeding in the food web. And those results, so we have museum specimens dating back a century. And the results from that study suggest that the birds are feeding pretty much on the same things as they were 70, 80, 90 years ago. What it doesn't tell us, though, is are those species as abundant now as they were? So maybe their diet hasn't changed, but there's less of it, and that's causing them to really struggle. That's the part that we still don't have an answer for yet. And that's a really hard one to get at because you can't use indirect tools like you can to determine the diet. But what we strongly suspect is that, yes, the change in abundance of forage fish, abundance and availability, is a contributing factor. What we're trying to understand better now is how important a factor is it? So I wanted to show you this photo really quickly. This is the main colony. And this is kind of sad when you think, okay, this is the Tufted Puffin colony on Destruction Island. There's a couple of nests on the backside, and there are a couple of nests on the nearby finger, but this is our main study site. So we have marked burrows. Again, we're very concerned about disturbance. We do virtually nothing hands-on. And we do observations like here's that actually the student that did the wonderful study of kind of historical diet, Robin Thomas, doing observations on this rock finger, which is across a cut from that slope. So we can sit there, observe birds completely non-invasively, and document a lot of aspects of their breeding season. You'll notice this is during nice weather. We also sit up on these areas when it's not quite so nice on the outer coast of Washington, but it is, again, such a privilege to work out in these wild places, even when the weather is not quite so agreeable. So we do things like monitor burrow visitation rates. You can see here is a tufted puffin coming out of burrow number 32. It had just fed its chick. So we document frequency of provisioning. We also track the fates of these burrows using these infrared cameras, which doesn't, again, involve any handling of birds. We look at colony activity patterns. So how many birds are on the colony? How many are offshore? How many are circling? And we can use that as a comparison within and between years. We also use technology like trail cameras. So these two posts, and they are camouflaged, but these have trail cameras attached. This is a tufted puffin burrow entrance. So we can deploy these cameras, set them up to record, and anytime a puffin lands, and they land fast, we will get a visual record. So the camera will be triggered, it will take a photo, and if we're lucky enough, if the bird comes in at the right angle, we can actually see if it has prey in its bill. So that provides us with information that we wouldn't be able to collect when we're not there, because we're not out on these islands all the time. So here's another photo. It's almost like this bird is posing. Here's the camera right here. There's a nice tufted puffin, and right, these yellow stakes mark burrow entrances. There's a burrow entrance right behind this bird, and then another burrow entrance right down here. So we use a variety of direct observations as well as technology like trail cameras and these acoustic recorders. We are really interested, coming back to that question of diet, we're really interested in diet. And so we do this a couple of ways. The most labor-intensive way is to sit out there, like Lily is doing here, with a thermos, with a camera, with binoculars, and tufted puffins tend to circle before they land at their burrows. And so we have this wonderful location where we can sit there, not disturb the birds. They ignore us completely. We see them coming in. We get our eyes on them. We get our camera ready. And as the bird comes by, and not all photos are as good as this one, but we can get photos like this where we can identify, is it fish? Is it squid? Is it something else? How many fish? How big are the fish? And in some cases like this, we can actually get it to species. And that provides a tremendous amount of information that's really improving our understanding of their diet. So with respect to how they're faring in the Sailor Sea, again, I've alluded to this earlier. So there's Smith Island on a beautiful morning as we were coming in to do observations. Smith Island is the stronghold. Last summer, we documented 25 breeding pairs. Historically, we don't know, but the limited data suggests that there were 100 to 200 pairs on that island. Protection Island, again, probably over 200 pairs historically. Right now, we're struggling to find burrows. We suspect that it's no more than 5 on the entire island. And that's it for the Sailor Sea. And that's really worrying. It's very conceivable that, but before I even retire, we may lose tufted puffins from Protection Island if that decline isn't stemmed quickly. And so we're because we've studied Rhinoceros auklets in great detail, and comparable aspects of their ecology to that of tufted puffins, we can compare the two. And we talk about this as a tale of two puffins because Rhinoceros auklets are puffins. The common name suggests otherwise, but genetically speaking and functionally and ecologically speaking, they're puffins. And so because we've studied both species on the same islands, we can actually gain some insights into what might be driving these declines in tufted puffins while Rhinoceros auklets are doing just fine. So if we look at population size, we say, well, Rhinoceros auklets are stable or increasing on the islands where we're studying them. Tufted puffins, as I just mentioned, shared with you, they're declining kind of on all of the islands. Reproductive success. Well, the evidence compared to the 1970s is that Rhinoceros auklets are actually doing more. They're more successful breeders now than they were even 30 or 40 years ago, both in the Salish Sea and on the outer coast. Reproductive success for tufted puffins, presumably, we don't have good data historically for Washington, but given the declining population size, we're inferring that it has declined. And then the diet, this is the piece that we're trying to really untangle, one of the pieces that we're really trying to untangle. What we do know is there was some really great work by Ulrich Wilson and Laura Leshner from the 1970s of diet of Rhinoceros auklets on Protection Island and Destruction Islands. And the diet is unchanged. It's indistinguishable across, from the mid 70s to the early 2000s up through today. We don't have the luxury of being able to make the same comparison with tufted puffins. But again, those stable isotope results suggest that they're feeding on similar things. It's just whether they can access those same things to the same degree. And that stable isotope study did suggest to us that tufted puffins have what we would call, and I'll explain this in a minute, a slightly narrower foraging niche, which means that they don't feed on as broad an array of fish species as Rhinoceros auklets. Rhinoceros auklets seem remarkably good at just dealing with whatever comes their way. If it's a good anchovy year, they're going to bring in a bunch of anchovy. If it's not, they'll prey switch and they'll switch to something else and usually do equally well. Tufted puffins, again, from this study, it suggests that they're not quite as flexible. And that may be part of the story. If they don't have that same flexibility, if they're kind of more narrowly focused, if their diet, their preferred diet, if that changes in abundance and availability, then they're not going to be able to compensate for it like a Rhinoceros auklet would. There's still a lot to figure out, but we're trying to chip away at this and generate these insights. So I'm going to transition now to pigeon guillemots. And this is just something, again, they're not a species of conservation concern, but they are an indicator species by the Puget Sound Partnership as part of their vital sign indicators. And there is a remarkable project. This to me is just, this sort of work is what, on dark days, gives me hope. So Whitby Audubon and some remarkably visionary people in Whitby Audubon about 14 years ago, started what they called the Whitby Pigeon Guillemot Project. It's a community science, and they have been they've continued it since, I thought they started earlier than 2008, but this figure just shows at least 2008. But they look at breeding success at these area, a number of different kind of colonies, and they also look at diet. And the project has been so successful that we've actually helped them expand it. So it's now in the South Sound, it's out on the peninsula, and it is a remarkable effort by volunteers that was volunteer generated. And it is really giving us unparalleled insights into what's going on with pigeon guillemots. There's no way that Scott or Tom or I could generate this scale of a project, with the resources we have. This is the power of community-based science. When you can mobilize people to collect across years and spatial scales like this. It's a similar thing with the Puget Sound Seabird Survey, which is not species specific. But what they have shown is that, as this figure kind of shows, that the pigeon guillemot population has been, it varies a bit. This is for Whidbey Island, and that's what you would expect with a population. It doesn't, a real population in the real world is not flat. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. But this suggests a very stable population over 13 plus years. I just wanted to show that, so we do have some neat data. It gives us great insights into pigeon guillemots, and it is all thanks to community scientists and volunteers. And then I wanted to transition to talk a little bit about marbled murrelets. And this is a project that I got started I started thinking about it a few years ago, and we really started to get into it with a student of mine last summer. Most of they're a species of conservation concern, state and federally. I wanted to give a quick overview. They're very strange seabirds in one important respect. So they're a diving seabird, they're an alcid, they feed mainly on fish. But for those of you that don't know much about the natural history of marbled murrelets, arguably the biggest reason for their decline is illustrated in this figure. So unlike most sensible seabirds that breed on offshore islands where there are no mammals, there's no disturbance and so forth, marbled murrelets have evolved this preference for breeding in old growth forests. So they make their nests sometimes 10 to 20, 30 miles inland from the water. They'll fly into these mature forests where there are old growth or mature second growth trees with large limbs. And then they will make a simple nest on a large branch or limb, and then fly to and from the ocean every day to provision their chick. So with the loss of old growth forests for timber purposes, they have lost a lot of critical habitat. And that is arguably the single greatest driver of their decline in California, Oregon, and Washington. So I wanted to just give that little backstory for those of you that are unfamiliar with the species. How it comes in to inform our work locally is that I'm a really keen sea kayaker. And over the years, I started noticing during the summer months, places I paddle regularly, I'm like, there are murrelets here. It seems like every time I paddle around, Browns Point Lighthouse or Dash Point or around Gig Harbor, the mouth of Gig Harbor, I'd see, one or a handful of marbled murrelets. And I just kind of took some informal notes. And look, this is something worth investigating. So Scott Pearson, my colleague at the state, he oversees the state project on marbled murrelets and including at-sea surveys. And so I asked him if their at-sea surveys had really picked up these spots. And they are only able to do a survey like in this area once or twice every couple of years. And they're moving through fairly quickly. They're amazing surveys. But the number of birds is small enough that it's easy to miss them. And he said that none of these areas had been really picked up. So last summer, I started working with a student of mine and using a combination of boat and kayak-based observations and then shore-based surveys and observations, we've identified, at least from last year, these three areas. So this area between Dash Point and especially around Browns Point Lighthouse, off the mouth of Gig Harbor. So inshore waters, there's always a shelf. So it's shallow waters where they're foraging. And then down here off Point Fosdick, we also suspect there's a spot down here around the mouth of Chambers Creek, just south of the Chambers Bay golf course, the place we're going to do some work this summer. But what this suggests is, and these are birds that are there pretty much throughout the breeding season. They're in breeding plumage. And what it suggests is that, and if they are back there again this year, and these are consistent hotspots, that we might have some marbled murrelets that are breeding in some remnant old growth forest somewhere in the South Sound. Historically, they certainly were breeding in this region, but we don't have much of that habitat left. And it would be pretty remarkable if they're still breeding, even in small numbers, in our region. So that's a further step. This summer, we're hoping to do more surveys to really document their distribution and use of these waters, and try to raise awareness of the potential importance of this as critical local habitat for this state-listed and federally listed species. And then, in a few years, if those patterns hold, then the daunting challenge arises. How do we actually try to figure out where they're breeding? Because these birds only come and go at night as a predator avoidance strategy. So you have a small seabird, this big, that's flying at 40 miles an hour in the dark, up some river drainage. The odds of seeing it are, and if you're only talking about a handful of birds, it's a tall order to try to figure out where they are. But that's a future step. Right now, we're just trying to better understand the use of the marine habitat in our area. But I wanted to share that because I think it's not well known. If you go onto eBird and if you were to check for marbled murrelets, it would pop up. But we have some pretty cool spots where we can consistently see marbled murrelets during the summer season. And Browns Point Lighthouse, especially if you get there in the morning when you've got the light behind you, great viewing of marbled murrelets foraging actively, sometimes 30 or 40 meters offshore, sometimes a little bit farther off, but really fantastic. So just to really wrap up quickly, I wanted to talk a little bit about, and these threats apply to Alcids, but not uniquely to Alcids. So I broadened it to just thinking, kind of global, and even more broadly, many of these threats are threats that are common to seabirds around the world. They're not unique to our waters in Washington, but changes in prey availability and abundance. And those are two separate things. Abundance is how many there are. Availability is, can you get what's there? And that can change, especially as we think about changing ocean climate. The distribution, the absolute number of fish might be the same, but they might be deeper. They may be displaced in a way that birds can't access them in the same way. Or conversely, they may get better access to some species. Recovery of avian predators. And this is one which is a remarkable success story, and yet it's also a challenge. What happens when your endangered species eats my endangered species? Sort of a story. So we should be celebrating the remarkable recovery of raptors, of peregrine falcons, of bald eagles, but they're recovering into systems that are different ecologically now than what they disappeared from. Largely, 50, 70, 80 years ago. And so, bald eagles are a great example. They're an opportunistic predator. Historically, they probably fed primarily on salmon in our region. But salmon runs are a tiny fraction of what they were historically. They can be flexible predators. So they're shifting and they're preying on seabirds a lot more. The mere sight of a bald eagle will cause all tufted puffins to abandon the colony, and they won't come back for hours. So even an eagle that's completely disinterested in tufted puffins can actually disrupt the provisioning of chicks during that stage of the season, through no fault of their own. But that's a challenging thing to try to grapple with. contaminants and pollution, in our waters, there's chronic contaminants, there's acute pollution events, fisheries bycatch. This is something that was, we do think this had a big impact on many Alcid species in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. There is still some bycatch. There's been some very effective mitigation methods developed that has greatly decreased seabird bycatch in Washington waters. That's to be celebrated, but there are still challenges. Shoreline armoring, which we may think of as an indirect effect, and it is, but shoreline armoring affects the productivity of our inshore waters and nutrients that naturally would be flowing in from the near shore into the waters. That affects the productivity, which affects fish, which affects the seabirds. So understanding that hardening of shorelines ultimately has consequences for marine birds. Introduce species. Those can be plants that alter breeding habitat. It can be things like in this photo, introduced European rabbits like out on Destruction Island. They disturb, they change the habitat, and they also compete for burrows with burrow nesting seabirds like this tufted puffin. Disturbances at the breeding colonies, again, thankfully, virtually all of the important breeding colonies for seabirds in Washington are federally and or state protected. At sea, though, there's disturbance with shipping traffic, recreational boats, fishing boats. So these are not all equally important to all species, but this is a kind of a more or less comprehensive list of potential threats. Harmful algal blooms, which seem to be increasing in frequency as we're seeing warmer waters and we're getting more nutrient input into our inshore marine systems. Climate change, one of the metaphysical challenges of our time and for future generations. And accompanying that is ocean acidification. So there's a lot, that seabirds, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the species, are confronted with. I do want to spend a little bit of time, and I can't remember who asked the question, but this forage fish question. And forage fish are so fundamentally important. And this is something where, again, we have a voice. We can write to our state representative. We can communicate with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. For marine systems, and I love this figure by the Pew Environment Group. We look at how this is set up. We're looking at energy flow. So this is a simplified food web. We have plankton down here, and this is both phytoplankton, which are kind of the plant equivalents, but then zooplankton. Those are eaten by what we kind of broadly lump into forage fish. So these are lower level forage fish species, things like smelt, herring, young salmon, sand lance. And those, you can see, they're the bottleneck because they are the source of, direct or indirectly, the energy flow that go to higher trophic levels, the upper trophic level predators. So large predatory fish, marine mammals, seabirds, all depend either directly on forage fish or indirectly because they eat the things that eat forage fish. So almost everything in our system locally goes through forage fish. And recognizing that is so important because it really gives a sense of urgency to our efforts to try to make sure that we're managing that and tracking forage fish. At the state level, just because of resources, not because of a lack of will, the only forage fish that are systematically tracked are herring, and because they are there's commercial interest in them. And things like sand lance and other equally important species for this food web, we don't have nearly as good an understanding of what's going on with their populations. And if we look at kind of, these again are simplified, but we look at food webs. This figure here is a historical food web for our region. So what you want to notice are the categories that are bolded, because these are groups that historically in our region really helped regulate and drive the structure of our food webs in our region. So it's not to say these other things weren't important, but we have phytoplankton, which is fed on by zooplankton. And the arrows show you what feeds on what predominantly. So here you see right central to all of this, forage fish, bolded. Look at how many arrows go to and from forage fish. A lot of the things, again, just flow through forage fish or flow through forage fish indirectly, because like killer whales, orcas that are eating salmon are eating forage fish. So ultimately, killer whales are dependent on forage fish. And you have rockfish, you have seabirds. This is a comparable food web, kind of present day. What you'll see is the change in some things largely disappear, and then the change in which functional groups ecologically have become important drivers of the system. You see forage fish, they're still present, they're still important, but the role that they play is not as great as the role that they played historically. Similarly, salmon. Seabirds are in general less abundant. So what we're seeing is the rise in jellies. We have huge populations of jellies in our region. The rise in things like Dungeness crabs and ratfish. So there are some big changes to our marine ecosystem right here in Washington State. And those have consequences for those top level predators, whether those are seabirds, humans, orcas, or other marine or salmon. But I don't want to leave on a depressing note. So just to wrap up, I mean, with our colleagues, we're working on trying to use research and monitoring to inform conservation. So this is very applied work. We're trying to understand trends in species, some of which have never been described before for Washington, for multiple seabird species. Trying to better understand, we have that list of threats, but we can't treat all of them. And we want to, if we want to be effective and efficient with our use of limited resources, we really need to understand better what threats are disproportionately important. So we're trying to develop a refined understanding of that. Part of that includes monitoring breeding seasons, and also better understanding marine habitat use, like that example with the Marbled Murrelets right here in the South Sound. Thankfully, we have, through the foresight of a number of people years ago, this wonderful Washington Maritime National Wildlife Refuge Complex, which includes most of the outer coast islands. It doesn't include Tatoosh, but Tatoosh is de facto a refuge because it's owned and protected by the Makah Nation. And then a lot of islands, the smaller islands in the San Juans, as well as Smith and Protection. So nearly all former and current Tufted Puffin colonies and the important Washington Seabird Islands fall within that refuge system, which we are incredibly fortunate to have. We're starting to talk with some of our colleagues, especially the refuge folks, about doing some habitat restoration on some focal breeding islands to try to stabilize soil and improve breeding habitat, with the hope that that might improve breeding success and maybe even think about doing some social attraction for Tufted Puffins on islands like Protection Island. The habitat is still there, but there's space for Tufted Puffins there. If we can bring them in and if the surrounding marine conditions are sufficiently good that they can thrive. I'm going to bring it back into the conversation again, forage fish populations. You're keeping track of that. And there is some legislation out there, and seeing what we're doing at the state level and what we're not doing at the state level. The state manages a lot of that. And so holding them to account, trying to make sure the resources are allocated for us to understand and manage them effectively. And then ultimately, so much of this, and this ties into that last point, that so much of this really depends on what we want as a community, collectively. that, we all have an important role to play in this, whether it's doing research, whether it's, Cindy's wonderful activity, bringing people together to engage in creative outcomes and thinking and learning together, and then sharing those. Who knows where those sorts of activities carry us? They ripple outward. So those actions matter. Going out to Brown's Point and sharing with somebody, hey, that bird out there, did you know that bird's an endangered seabird? Who knows? They might get really interested, and they may have resources or connections. So using our own platforms and our own voices, and really trying to center communities in this sort of work, so that it's not coercive, but that people want to engage because they understand. And then when they understand, they can appreciate and they begin to love and value, which all of you understand, because I'm preaching to the converted with that. But I think you're all in positions, irrespective of what you do professionally, to share these messages. So with that, I want to thank you very much. I've got my contact information down below, my email. I've got a couple of emails. One is with the nonprofit that I work with, and the other one is with the university. I look at both of them equally. And then Dale also has my contact information. But what I'll do at this point is stop this screen sharing so that I can see folks and more easily refer to questions or comments in the chat. But if there's still time for questions, I'd be happy to entertain any questions that folks might have.
Quite informative. You're making it awful hard for me to get some shots of some of those birds, though. There's not enough of them.
Yeah, sadly, yes.
And you were talking about the Tacoma Zoo. I got some great shots up close of them diving underwater and getting fish.
Oh, that's great. Yeah,
Put the lens right up against the window.
Yes, it is a fantastic. You could easily spend an afternoon just there watching them. Really, really entertaining, and especially during the breeding season. You'll see, if you're there during a feeding time, you'll see some of the tufted puffins. There are some breeding pairs, and they will grab the fish, and then they'll happily trundle up the slope and go disappear into their burrow. It's really just a remarkable resource we have locally.
I had a quick question. With regards to the murrelets from Brown's Point and Gig Harbor area, do you think they're more likely nesting on the Olympic or Key Peninsula or in the Cascade foothills?
That is a wonderful question, Kaylin. I have no idea. I mean, until we start seeing these, and we're not even 100% sure that they are breeding down here. I think the numbers, if I had to guess, I would wager that they are breeding in small numbers. But where that is, these birds, they could fly across, into the southern tip of Hood Canal over land, without any problem. I don't think they would hesitate doing that. So they could be in on the Olympic slope there, in Hood Canal, and flying all the way over here to feed during the day. It's possible they're flying up to, and I'm not suggesting this is the case, but like it wouldn't be unrealistic to think that maybe they're flying up to Puyallup and they're nesting in Federation Forest. I don't know. That's nice forest. It's a haul, but they do fly that far inland. One of the things that we're hoping to do this summer is, and this isn't going to refine it greatly, but do some observations. If we can be out at some of these sites right around dusk when the birds, if they're still there, if they're starting to depart, possibly to start to stage to fly up at night, if we can get general departure directions, like even from Browns Point Lighthouse, for example, are they flying north? Are they flying across Dalco Passage towards Gig Harbor? Are they flying around the corner and up into Commencement Bay? Even that would give us something about where if they are flying off with fish at night or in the evening, the general direction that they might be. You can hear all the qualifiers that I'm putting in, Caitlin, because it is just so challenging, especially with small numbers of birds. Yes, and Cindy, thank you for all that great information. I was going to say, so if folks are interested in Puget Sound Seabird Survey, I helped develop that, and I'm on the technical committee for that. I can speak to that at some point. We're always looking for volunteers, for folks that are interested in participating in it. And then Rare Bird by Maria Mudruth is a really fine book. She's a local author. She's based in Olympia. Really good book about marbled murrelets. And then again, thanks. Audubon Washington has done some fantastic work recently, led by Trina Bayard, working on forage fish legislation. So part of the reason I mentioned that is that there's actually been some movement at the state level within the last year or two about forage fish. So it is really timely, to let folks, your representatives know, and share the word that there's movement in that direction. But the more voices, the better.
Peter, thank you for this amazing presentation. It's just, there's just so much to think about. And, obviously some of it is a bit gutting in terms of some numbers, but it's also inspiring in terms of, all of the things that are being done. And I think one of the things often is we have so many different groups who want to do things or, whatever, that we're not all as strong as we could be. And so in terms of your wish list, what do you think for our Rainier Audubon? What is something that we could rally behind that would be really powerful? And I know that you've given some examples, but what do you feel? And then also from an individual perspective, what do you think are the most powerful things?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question, Cindy. I think, you and the nice thing is that with Audubon Washington and Trina's kind of leadership on a lot of this forage fish work, one of the nice things is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I think from an Audubon chapter perspective, leveraging some of that work, like that, keeping on top of some of the forage fish work is fantastic, because the more that our legislators hear about that, the more that Fish and Wildlife hears that this is a priority. And that can be done. The nice thing about that is it can be done collectively as a chapter where you write a letter on behalf of Rainier Audubon. You can also send out talking points to the membership and say, in addition, here, it doesn't need to be long, but if you take 15 minutes and include these talking points, please send a letter here or an email. Here's who it goes to. Those sorts of things, they still matter. I mean, it's sometimes it's hard to believe, but I've heard from legislators that they're not saying they read every letter, but they have aides doing it, and they're looking at volume. They're like, whoa, look at all this interest in this issue, and the interest is coming from Federal Way and Burien and Tacoma and Olympia and out on the peninsula. It's not just, a group that, has their underwear in a wad and is upset about something. It's a bigger, broader issue. So I think that's a great, and that's historically, that's been one of the strengths of Audubon Society and Audubon chapters, is that capacity to mobilize, and leverage people's commitment to supporting conservation work. So let's see, that to me is kind of low-hanging fruit, because it is something that is in the news, and getting coverage and attention legislatively. I think some of it too is going, when you can, just getting out locally and spending time with these birds. I think when you have that opportunity, and I'm not a birder that drives, far afield to go look for things, but we've got such great places just locally to see, whether it's during the winter months or during the summer months. Like that example, come out to Browns Point Lighthouse in the summer. It's stunning. It's such a beautiful place. You could spend half a day there or whatever, and really just enjoy seeing some marbled murrelets. Hopefully, they do seem to be there pretty consistently, and I think that, although that may seem like, well, what does that do? Well, I think on some level it makes it real. When you get to a place, you see, yeah, so this spot is important to these birds, and I'm seeing these birds and I'm getting to watch them. I'm seeing them dive and I'm seeing them come up, and they're more real to me. And I think that has real consequences for our capacity to act. Removing the abstraction. And I think, I suspect that I'm preaching largely to the choir with respect to this. You're out there going birding and enjoying and appreciating and deepening your understanding of local natural history, but there's huge value to that, and bringing others with you, and sharing that enthusiasm. The state didn't even know about these areas, officially, and it's like, well, a few of us are starting to unpack this a little bit. So one thing I will say too, and I'm not sure I'm going to pull this off for this summer, but I think that there'd be some fun potential to do a community science project centered around marbled murrelets kind of in our area. If folks are potentially interested, I'll keep you in the loop. But my idea is that, and it would only be a few months of the year, because they're not, marbled murrelets are not around, they're year round. As far as I know, they begin appearing middle of April and they're gone at the end of July, beginning of August. But my students and I can do some work. But if we were able to mobilize, even if there were 10 or 20 people that were interested in going out weekly, that might mean that we get daily coverage instead of a few days a week, or we could have coverage across an entire day and do a study of how they use the area across a day. That'd be really interesting. And that's harder to do at scale if it's just one or two of my students and me doing it. So I think it could be a simple way to collect.
I hate to interrupt, but we're running out of time.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Really appreciate your presentation, and I'll be looking for them.
That's great, and thank you, Cindy. Yeah, well, so what I'll do is follow up with, with all of you. And again, I'm pretty maxed out this. It's been a long academic year, teaching. I'm not sure I have the energy to pull it off for this year. But even if it's informal, and maybe it's just a handful of folks, and we just get some of you out there and say, hey, you want to come do some marbled murrelet observations? Let's do a little pilot project with it, and then we formalize it for the next year. And I've been in touch with the Browns Point, the Points Northeast Historical Society, and they seem to think that there might be interest too. So I think we could get a nice group of folks together. But thank you, Jay. I don't want to abuse people's time.
Please keep us posted on what you decide, and send any one of us an email, and we'll get the word out.
I certainly will. And again, I appreciate the interest, and I think it could be a cool way to broaden, and to share this.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Peter. I guess this is it for March. April's next.